Welcome to FYI with the FYMs. I'm Oliver Yao, and I work with the Office of New Student Programs here at the University of Pittsburgh to help new Panthers adjust to the transition into college life. Transitioning to college for me was difficult. Probably the most important thing I learned from my first year was the importance of mindset. I realized that by changing the way I look at things, the things I look at change. It was really fascinating, but I knew I was only scratching the surface. So I talked to an expert, Dr. Omid Fatuhi, a social psychologist and research associate for the University of Pittsburgh's Learning Research and Development Center. He studies the mindset skills that affect the way students look at their lives, and here's what he had to say. Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Omid Fatuhi, for joining us. And just want to get started by asking, what is your background? Like, what brought you to Pitt?
What brought me to Pitt? Well, actually, my wife and I are both social psychologists, and we were doing our postdoctoral fellowships at Stanford University. And while we were there, it was my wife who got a position here at Pitt in the social psychology department. And through some shared contacts and collaborators, I began speaking with the folks in the Learning Research and Development Center, and they heard about my wife coming, so they opened up a position for me to join their team here as well. So at Pitt, I am a research associate with a background in social psychology focused on interventions that increase and promote better and more optimal performance in the domains of athletics, academics, and leadership.
So how did you come to this topic of social psychology, but more specifically like student success and college transition? Like what made you interested in this, or what sparked this?
I was able to find a topic that I was really curious about, that was informed by my own experiences. And my own experiences were essentially leading me to become an expert on making mistakes, because I was making mistakes in all of the domains that you can imagine. That ranged from my choices in academics, that included my choices around my personal relationships, and that included even my career choices. And ultimately, what I ended up landing on was this field of psychology that began to shed light on why I was making the decisions I was making and how those decisions could be improved. And that's ultimately why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, because in many ways, I had become an expert at making mistakes. And I realized that I may not be the only one in this space, in this particular experience, that many of us are making mistakes on a day-to-day basis. And I also realized that there must be strategies that we can employ as the way to more effectively overcome these mistakes. And sure enough, the specific field of social psychology, with a specialization on optimal performance, shed light on the many strategies that are available to people on a day-to-day basis that they can employ to achieve better outcomes for themselves.
That's really interesting. I really liked what you talked about of making mistakes and how everyone makes mistakes. But I think it really is the mindset that we have about ourselves and about mistakes that can really help us overcome challenges and times of difficulty. And how did you grow this mindset, or come to a shift in mindset on your own, in your own life?
Yeah, luckily I was encouraged by some of the research around this space. So there is well demonstrated research that shows that people can view similar experiences in slightly different ways. And depending on how they see or view those same events, can lead to dramatically different outcomes. As an example, there's work by Carol Dweck that talks about growth mindset. And in her work, what she lays out is essentially the fundamental difference in which people view or think about intelligence. And on one side, there are people who view intelligence or ability, if you will, as this set of traits that are fixed, that some people have more or less of, versus other people who see intelligence or ability as a set of skills that you can acquire through through effort and through the employment of effective strategies. And as you might predict, if you view intelligence or ability as something that you can acquire, you're actually much more likely to become encouraged and stay engaged in the face of difficulty and challenge. So if you believe that intelligence is something that you can become better at by struggling and wrestling with difficulty and challenges, then you're less likely to become discouraged if you get a D in that math class, if you don't get the core insight of the lesson right away, if you don't get positive feedback. You're less likely to get discouraged by those things. And as a result, if you're less likely to get discouraged, you're more likely to stay engaged and probably are more likely to draw out more learning from that opportunity. Consequently, you're probably more likely to do better in whatever performance evaluations there are. And importantly, that set of behaviors and that set of outcomes then reinforces your initial beliefs. So if you believe that intelligence is something that you have to experience by exerting effort and staying engaged with the difficult things, then you stay with the studying longer, you do better on the test, and then because you do better, that reinforces that belief. Now, all of these different trajectories began with a simple difference, seemingly subtle and small, in terms of how people make meaning about similar events or artifacts in their lives. And was exactly what inspired me to explore the very many different ways in which we make attributions about our lives, about the events that occur, that can lead to these diverging paths that some people, in the face of challenge, in the face of mistakes, in the face of ambiguity, or in the face of lack of structure, either are able to thrive versus others that become disparaged and discouraged and disengage. And so it really did pull me into this area of trying to uncover each of these domains where mindset, the way that you make meaning of the events in your life, can lead to these different outcomes. And ultimately, how is it that we can train ourselves to have more of these adaptive mindsets is what's really the core of what I'm passionate about.
That's really fascinating. In your work, can you share a story of a student that really stood out to you?
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of these examples are incredibly insightful. So in my work, I speak with many students, and from time to time, there'll be a question or a story that fully captures the different ways in which people basically take a stance or an approach on their studying and their lives. Here's an example of a student who really was having a hard time. And this comes up actually pretty commonly, especially in some fields like the STEM fields, where an individual might begin to try to learn something, and they just find that learning difficult. They find the topic dense, at times confusing, at times maybe even abstract. And they take that experience of difficulty as a sign that maybe they are not capable of learning this content, and the interpretation or the narrative that they form for themselves is that maybe I'm not a math person. And once you've arrived at that statement, which is something that I hear from time to time, it's almost too late. It's almost as though all of the negative mindsets have done their damage, because you have been in a position or in an event where you had to navigate the difficulty of learning. And in your mind, the way that you interpreted that difficulty is that maybe this is a sign that this is not what I'm meant to do. And ultimately, if you get to that stage, then in subsequent experiences or opportunities to learn, where again it's difficult or you don't do as well as you'd like or learn as quickly as you'd like, then that narrative or that attribution around what that means will come online, and you will consequently not learn or draw as much learning as you could. So this phrase of maybe I'm not a math person, maybe I'm not a physics person, is a really good example of the way in which mindset plays out for many students. I'll tell you quickly a couple of more examples. Sometimes I hear students saying, it just takes so long to study or to learn something. And again, although that may seem to be true, when you are getting to that point where you're trying to make meaning of what does it mean that learning takes so long, you have to realize again that what they're trying to make meaning about is what that means about them. Because if they feel like learning is taking too long, the question that's top of their mind is, what does this mean about my potential to learn this topic? And if the question that's looming large in their mind is, why is this taking so long? Chances are the answer that they're trying to generate is that maybe this is not something I'm meant to do. So this notion that learning ought to happen quickly is another great example of how people can fall into this negative mindset.
How can we stay focused and motivated while studying, especially when we're in our room without being in a classroom, without having kind of like the pressure of paying attention when you're in a classroom, because everyone else is there too. They can obviously see when you're not paying attention. So how can students overcome those distractions that come with virtual learning?
Recognize that attention is not going to simply be there just because you want it to be there. That you have to forcefully carve out some space for it to do what it's intended to do. The second has to do with this over-reliance and even this dependence that we have formed through many years of our educational system, where we have now come to expect the externally defined deadlines to tell us when to do what we need to do. So we rely on the syllabus to tell us when something is due. We rely on our teachers to tell us when something is due. What that means is that we have foregone the opportunity to develop the skill to self-manage. And essentially, when you're finding yourself having a hard time focusing or staying motivated, it's not a lack of motivation. It's just the skill of being able to manage your time so that you understand, if you want to achieve a particular outcome, what do you have to do today? What do you have to do right now to make timely progress towards that outcome? And I bet you that the vast majority of people who will say, listen, I have a hard time staying motivated, don't have well and clearly defined goals, including specific tasks that they have scheduled on particular days. So if you at the beginning of the week are able to lay out the rest of your week so that this week's work allows you to accomplish this month's goals, then you will know that in this 2-hour session, you have to achieve what you've sort of scheduled yourself to do so that you can make timely progress towards your end of month goals. So these two elements, recognizing that there is an attack on your attention and that self-management is a skill that unfortunately we have offloaded to our educational system, can potentially help students take better control over their time and their attention.
So in my life, at the beginning of the week, I would have a lot of energy, and I would plan out my week on my calendar, and I'd say, okay, like on Tuesday afternoon, I would do this task, and I'd be really energetic and ready to do it. And then when the Tuesday comes around, I don't do it.
Yeah.
What's going on? Like, even though I make a lot of commitments, but when it comes down to it, I don't do it.
Yeah, there's a couple things, and there's some technical terms. One is called the planning fallacy, and the other is called the forecasting error. And what those two things essentially mean is that, first of all, we have a hard time anticipating the complications or the distractions that occur in our day-to-day lives when we set out plans for ourselves, right? So, like, I may intend to go and read a certain chapter by the end of the week, but I don't recognize that throughout that week, when I get home, that people will want to spend time with me, that I'll have some chores to do, that I'll have some shopping to do. So I don't plan or anticipate effectively and accurately enough all of the things that can bombard my time. The second, the affective forecasting error, has to do with our notion of how we expect or anticipate things will feel like or ought to feel like when we actually have to do them. So at nighttime, when I go to sleep, I will say, tomorrow morning, I will go running, and I'll be really excited about that goal that I set for myself. I'll be pumped. And that the morning comes around, and guess what? That bed feels really comfortable, and it's cold outside, and I'm tired. So we don't anticipate what it will feel like to actually do the work when we plan in advance to do that work. So how do you circumvent these challenges? One is that you can more accurately try to think and forecast some of the obstacles that come along or come in your way when you're trying to set effective plans. In fact, there's some really great work by Angela Duckworth, where she says that in order to set effective goals, you also need to anticipate some of the obstacles that might come along your way so that you can set goals accordingly. In fact, they have this method called the WHOOP strategy for setting goals: wishes, outcomes, objectives, and plans. And so you think about what you'd like to do. You then think about what the outcomes ought to be. Then you anticipate what the obstacles might be. And then you lay out your plan based on all of those, all of that understanding. And then the second thing, which I think is super important, is to realize that learning and studying and work in the moment by moment experience doesn't always feel great. And so if you come into the experience hoping that the plans and the excitement that you had about sitting down and focusing on that 2 hours of studying that you have will also be an experience that's filled with excitement and joy, then you're going to be disappointed. And that disappointment might actually cause you to get up and leave, because it basically contradicts what you had anticipated this would feel like. So what can you do? What you can do is to be mindful of the affective forecasting error and realize that in the moment of having to do the work may not actually feel as good as when you had made the plan to do the work. And this is, it's a subtle but important fact that learning is a slow process where we expect ourselves to stretch our minds beyond what we comfortably already know. That is the essence of learning. That is the essence of what becoming smarter is. It is to put yourself at the frontiers of your ability, that space, that place where you don't yet know something, and be able to live in that place, be able to sort of stay in that space where you're uncomfortable, where you don't yet know something, and be okay with being uncomfortable, with not knowing something, with something not feeling incredibly joyful, but knowing that it is in that space and in that time of struggle and wrestling with an idea where you might feel tempted to get up because it's not easy, that the learning actually happens. So where some of the adaptive mindset strategies can be utilized is reframing that lack of motivation or that lack of joy that causes many people to get up and walk away from the studying, to reframe it as this is exactly what studying ought to feel like. And if it feels uncomfortable, and if it doesn't feel enjoyable, then it means I'm learning. And therefore, that subtle shift, that subtle difference in how we view the learning experience can lead to these different outcomes, as in the example that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you for sharing that. And I did read that there's been a toolkit, Succeed at Pitt toolkit, or something that you've developed for Pitt students. Could you tell me more about that?
Yeah. So the Succeed at Pitt toolkit is intended to be essentially the subset of core mindsets that, at least in my experience, have the potential to lead to these different trajectories. That things like, what does it mean to be smart? Things like, what does it mean to take ownership? Things like, what does it mean to have passion? Depending on how you come to understand and experience the event in our lives that convey one meaning or the other, can lead to these different outcomes. My hope was that with this training, we can target each of these core sets of mindsets that do predict better outcomes, and then get people to critically think about the moments where they do grapple with these attributions around these common experiences that students have on a day-to-day basis. They're by no means intended to be exhaustive in terms of the set of ideas that we all grapple with, nor are they intended to be a one-size-fits-all. Rather, what we do is we lay out some core research on these experiences and these core mindsets that many students grapple with, and then create the opportunity for a dialogue and a discovery of how we engage with the learning experience, with the hope of being able to identify the more adaptive mindsets that students can employ in their day-to-day lives to more effectively succeed.
So I guess, are there 2 sessions, and one in the fall, one in the spring, and people can sign up for that?
That's right. So currently there are 2 sessions, and if you go to succeed@pitt.com, you can learn more about some of the training as well as registering for one of the sessions that we have.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fatuhi, for joining us and sharing your insight.
My pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of FYI with the FYMs. Stay tuned for more episodes on topics like hailing for change, featuring other amazing guests and first-year mentors. Hail to Pitt!